Welcome to Counterpoint. I recently looked up the term counterpoint in Wikipedia and came up with the definition that counterpoint really means independent voices searching for harmony. We're going to try and achieve that tonight. This is the second show in a hopefully an ongoing series of shows that deal with civic issues. This time, this program, we're going to be dealing with the topic of affordable housing. Recently, Almeda Creighton, one of the city council people, and I am the 3rd Ward City Councilman, Carl Scala. Recently, Almeda Creighton convened a group of interested citizens to talk about affordable housing. Some of my guests were in that audience. I'd like to introduce, on my left, Phil Steinhaus. He's been the CEO of the Columbia Housing Authority since January 2006. His emphasis has been to strengthen connections between the Columbia Housing Authority's affordable housing programs and the network of health and human services in our community. Next to him is Anthony Stanton, is a construction contractor specializing in green construction and infrastructure projects. He's a member of the city's Affordable Housing Task Force. And on my right is Rhonda Carlson. She's a builder, developer, realtor, and a member of the City Affordable Housing Policy Task Force. Her emphasis has been on supplying housing to Columbia's workforce. The City Council has recently sat down to talk about some of the goals that the Council itself wants to establish. And of course, what inevitably comes up is the issue of affordable housing and the welfare and the well-being of our city. At Ms. Creighton's recent Affordable Housing Conference, Phil Steinhaus gave a bit of a presentation to talk a little bit about the background of the Columbia Housing Authority and about the background of the advisory committee in trying to assist the City Council and the city with its affordable housing needs. Would you care to elaborate a little bit for us in this show?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Carl. Thank you. The Columbia Housing Authority has just turned 50 years old. It was formed in 1956, and it was basically formed as part of an urban renewal project to replace dilapidated housing that existed along the Providence corridor in and around the Blind Boone Center, East Park Avenue, and up around Lincoln Unity Drive in the central city area. That housing was developed down there between 1956 was our first project, and through I think 1964 was our last project in the downtown area. We have about 294 homes in that area, and it basically serves people that are at or below 30% of the median family income. Average income of our households living in public housing is right around $10,000 a year, so they're very low income. People pay rent. I think one of the things that's people misunderstand about public housing is that they think it's free housing, and it's not. You pay 30% of your adjusted household income for rent, and so as your income goes up, so does your rent. We have 719 units of public housing property. About half of that is in our 2 high-rise buildings, Oak Towers, which serves the elderly, and then Paquin Towers, which serves persons with disabilities. Then we also have about 1,062 Section 8 vouchers and some other specialty vouchers called Shelter Plus Care and tenant-based rental assistance vouchers. Basically, Section 8 is similar to public housing in that people pay 30% of their adjusted household income for rent, and then we pay the balance based on a fair market rent established by HUD and making sure that housing is sized right to the household or the family. So a single person doesn't get a 4-bedroom house, they get a 1-bedroom house. So Section 8 kind of is the second generation. I think I shared some information that I think people found interesting or helpful. Public housing was kind of that first generation of addressing housing issues across our country, in particular extreme and poorly dilapidated housing that had no running water or even plumbing or electrical issues. And so public housing grew across the land, but there were some places in which public housing didn't work, like Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis or Cabrini-Guerin in Chicago, and I know there are numerous other examples, in particular large metropolitan areas where they had lots of high-rises, where they clustered many people in poverty together, and crime and other issues, poor management kind of took over. And so in the 70s, HUD decided, which is the major funder of public housing, to kind of evolve affordable housing and let people spread out in the community and choose their own housing and choose their own neighborhoods and schools and places where they wanted to work and live. And so that's where Section 8 came from, and it evolved and it allows people, it's basically the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program, and it allows people to go out and choose housing out in the community. And again, they pay 30% of the rent based on their adjusted household income. Then towards mid to late 80s, I believe it is, HUD decided, well, Section 8 still wasn't quite getting exactly where they wanted to address the needs of affordable housing in the community. There are a number of reasons. One of them is that you have you're basically buying the housing for the landlords that provide the rental housing, and there isn't as much direct benefit to the persons towards home ownership or other things. I also found that some of the folks in Section 8 housing, even though there are housing quality standards and inspections on an annual basis, ended up in some of the not the best housing in the community. And landlords don't have to accept Section 8 housing, which is another misconception. The housing is the housing is attached to the person, and they get to choose. But a landlord can say, "Well, I don't do Section 8," and sometimes that can have some negative consequences for our tenants, a lack of available housing to choose from, because it is paperwork intensive. So kind of the third iteration of it came when the government started then funding tax credit housing. And what I think they realized is one of the best ways to produce additional affordable housing stock in our communities is to help subsidize developers and make it more affordable and profitable to put for developers to develop housing that is affordable for everyone. And you'll probably hear both Anthony and Rhonda talk a little more about workforce housing. And I think that's an important thing for people to remember when we're talking about affordable housing. It's for people who have to work. We need to have a full range of housing that's available to people of all incomes in our community. And also when we're talking affordable housing, we're talking not just home ownership, but we're talking about rental housing. And we also have to keep in what's the full cost of housing. You may be able to afford the rent, but if your utilities are twice as much as your rent, they're really high, then that's a huge issue too, particularly in older homes that tend to be more of our rental housing stock. And then you might find reasonable rent, but then if your utilities can really blow you out of the water and you become rent burdened. And anytime you're over that 30% thumbnail of your income paying for rent, whether it's subsidized or non-subsidized, you're considered rent burdened. So the Affordable Housing Task Force, which I'm on as well too, looked at rent burden as another issue in our community too. That are a number of people that are out there that are in housing, but in housing that's probably a little more expensive than what they can afford.
Yeah, I appreciate that historical perspective, and that's kind of where I wanted to go. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Affordable Housing Task Force, and maybe we ought to start at the beginning for the benefit of our audience and talk about the definitions, how the task force was established. I mean, the mayor appointed a distinguished panel of folks. I think were there 20 some folks? Is that correct, or something like that? Something like that. It was a large, group.
How many were at the meetings regularly?
And I know that the initial struggle was to even come up with a definition of what affordable housing is. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, and then
sure,
we can get into
give
the
you,
housing
or maybe
task
you've
force.
got it
No,
there,
I don't.
Rhonda. Okay. This is what the committee came up with, and we worked from several other groups that had also looked at this issue. We're not the first ones to think of it, and so we were more than happy to steal good ideas from other people as well too. So we said any housing where basic housing costs, including rent, utilities, mortgage payments, and home repairs necessary to maintain a reasonably safe and secure home in standard condition, are less than 38% of your household income if you're a homeowner, and 30% of your household income for renters. So it includes all the costs of living there: rent, utilities, or your mortgage payments, insurance, repairs. But also, we really felt it was important to talk about maintaining it in a safe condition, and that your home was in a secure neighborhood too, that you felt safe in your home. We felt that was also part of the affordable housing equation. I know one of the first things that happened to me when I started at the Housing Authority was I had a woman who was about to become homeless with her 7 children, and but she didn't want to live in public housing because she thought it was too dangerous for her children. And so that really made me sit up and take notice. Not that I didn't know we had some issues here, but that even a homeless woman would feel that that was not right for her kids. So it's something I'm trying to do something about. But
well, Phil's mentioned a few issues in this whole affordability idea. There's, of course, construction costs, land costs, energy costs, public transportation factors into this. There's incentives and subsidies. We can talk about that. You've had a good deal of experience, Rhonda, in the construction trades, providing. Can you relate some of your experience and how it kind of interfaces with some of these issues that?
Well, I think that there is a lack of affordable housing stock mainly, and with the exception of the last few months of what we've been seeing going on within the real estate industry and construction industry. The last few years, there's been more of a trend to build bigger houses on bigger lots, farther out, possibly or not possibly, depending on location, straining your infrastructure. We've concentrated over, and I can only speak to what we've done, is tried to concentrate on areas where the infrastructure is in place. If we are on the outside edges or fringes, we do make sure that that's something that we have taken into account, is to have the infrastructure in place. But you're dealing with land costs, regulatory costs, and these are not all generated through acts by the City Council or planning and zoning. A lot of them are regulatory, coming down from the federal government. There's certain heating and cooling standards that have been enacted that are federal law, certain things that there's no way around, but that do add to the cost of the house. Whether it's condominium or single family, but most of the homes that we have tried to build, we do try to build what we would call starter homes or last homes for people when they've sold and they know that this is going to be their last home that they may live in, and hopefully that they are able to live there for the remainder of their lives. It's a very big struggle because of land costs around here. What we talked about on our stuff is supply side solutions to that, not dealing with subsidies and those types of things.
I really like what I'm hearing here, because when you start talking about targeting the building and the construction that you're doing in areas where the infrastructure already exists, that's one of the primary components of growth management planning, and that's not to be confused with growth control. That's simply that the market forces determine how much growth there is in the city, but growth management planning takes advantage of the existing infrastructure to decrease the costs across the board.
And I wholeheartedly agree with that should be looked at. I probably would not be popular amongst some of my peer group sometimes, but I do believe there have been land grabs in the past based on what we think we can maximize our dollars on a land purchase versus what need am I really serving and how much of the cost is it to our community. And that doesn't mean that I think because the market will turn and the market will make those decisions. It doesn't necessarily require much regulation, but we have tried to structure the things that we have done on transportation routes or in areas where there isn't a need or it's already planned to be an improved road, those types of things, and not making sewer, water, and things come a long distance. So that has been a struggle on our part for the last 10 years, is to find ground that is affordable and has those things in place. And we've been pretty selective.
typically it tends to be more expensive if it's well developed in terms of infrastructure. But that's not necessarily always the case. And some of these affordable housing principles, at least my early review of some of these things, tend to suggest that some of the best candidates would be the central city, where these things have been in play for a long time. Now that brings up other issues of maintenance and replacement and that kind of thing. But it's not the kind of thing where you just go out and find a reasonable piece of property at a reasonable price and then have to pay to get all of the infrastructure towards it. And determining who pays for all of that infrastructure is, of course, part of this equation. I wanted to get Anthony Stanton into this discussion as well in terms of these issues. I know your history, at least what I know about you, has to do with some of the work that you've done in New Orleans.
Yes, sir.
With rebuilding and providing affordable housing down there. That's always an interesting place for me. It's kind of one of my favorite cities, I think,
Right.
because of a lot of reasons. Not the least of which is the character of the folks who had to survive Katrina.
Right.
They also know how to cook. They know how to throw parties. And they have a special sort of resilience. So New Orleans is kind of a special place. But I noticed when I was in New Orleans the last time, which was I think last year, that a lot of the areas that had been, not the areas that were totally wiped out, but some of the areas that were significantly damaged had been raised. And what was happening there was this whole process of gentrification, because all of a sudden this land was a lot more valuable than it used to be before. It was almost as if some of the city planners and some of the folks who had deep pockets decided, this is great. Everything has been raised. We can start from scratch and we can plan just exactly what it is that we have to do. Unfortunately, a lot of the folks that were displaced probably are never coming back, and even if they could come back, find that something has replaced what used to be affordable housing. Care to share any thoughts
Yes.
on that?
Oh boy. Every point that you made was exactly correct. Now I have another spin on it. Before Katrina, and you were there pre-Katrina,
Right.
a lot of areas were already distressed. But the powers that be couldn't really do anything about it. Katrina kind of accelerated the process that they were trying to get going anyway, of getting the land, getting it for cheap, knowing that its value is going to be higher, and dealing with it like that. I kind of see it in a negative way because, well, let me back up. I was involved with affordable housing before I went down to New Orleans. And the problems that we had in Columbia are minute compared to how they are in New Orleans. But it's almost like looking at Columbia through a microscope. We have the same exact issues and the same exact processes going on here, but it's so far down on the radar that it isn't getting the national or public attention that New Orleans is getting. But we have the same problems. Developers taking advantage of distressed properties. People not being able to really benefit from that. Okay, yeah, my house was destroyed. I own the land. Give me fair market, or at least get me into the process. A lot of things that are going on down there, they don't have these things in place. They didn't have an affordable housing policy committee. The guys with the money met with the guys with the votes, and they made their own initiative, and they pushed that. And there wasn't enough people to resist what they wanted to do, so whatever they wanted to do just happened. Ninth Ward is a perfect example. Ninth Ward still looks like the day after Katrina in most places, because it doesn't have a economic value to the city yet. So they're not putting their efforts there. They want to do something else. They don't want to build housing there. They want to do something else. And a lot of areas are like that. I'm building a house for a gentleman who was displaced. He lives in Houston. He happened to live in a historic area in New Orleans, in Midtown New Orleans. and it took almost 6 months, which would have took probably 3 weeks to get permits. I had to get permission. I had to prove that what I'm going to build there is going to be historical. I had to prove why I need to demolish the house that had 4 feet of water in it and had everything in the house since the storm to this day. So I had to prove why I had to demolish the house. Go through all this, meet with 2 different committees, an architectural committee and a historical committee. This is even before I even get a permit from the city to do anything.
And that's the bureaucracy of the government in Louisiana? Is that,
Yes.
that's a state
Yes.
problem?
It's Louisiana primarily. I mean,
Well,
it's
it's
New
Craft.
Orleans primarily. But what my point is, people that have been displaced trying to get their life back in order, it was a stressful situation for me, and I'm in the industry. Imagine you trying to do that yourself
Yeah.
and going through that. Imagine that you're elderly and you've had this land in your family for 3 or 4 generations. People are dying waiting for this process to go on.
But part of that was also set up just to keep people from swooping in and building poor stuff, ripping people off. They needed some kind of control, or else things could get out of hand pretty easy down there, right?
But they still are. So I
Yeah.
don't know if that's really really worked. And another point I want to make is my client just got his money at the beginning of this year. And I felt he was very lucky because he had a lot of his ducks in a row. So he didn't have a lot of insurance issues. He was pretty fortunate to be able to go through a smooth transition. So a smooth transition took 2 years. So imagine if you had any other problems.
Something that, do you mind?
No.
Something that you brought up when we were at the affordable housing meeting, and I think the point was a good point, is that now, I mean, your comment, and quoted in the paper, was Central City's hot. And I tend to agree to some degree, you're right. And you've experienced people coming in and trying to profiteer.
Yes.
And I think that probably bears some discussion.
Yeah.
Because I think that's part of the issue's been
it
ignored.
goes back to what you were talking about with sprawl. Urban sprawl happens when back in the 70s and the 80s, the hottest thing to do was to live in suburbia. So
Sure.
we built outwards and stretched our infrastructure. Well, we did that at such a rate that city officials get concerned because they're like, you're stretching our infrastructure. And when it starts affecting the market, then we make changes. And that's what's happened now. Now the hottest thing is new urbanism,
Yeah.
inner city living, condos.
Well, and that is so true, because I recently attended a conference in Chicago. It was a leadership conference, and I grew up in Chicago. I went to high school in Chicago, and then went in the military, and then did a lot of other kinds of things. But I always loved to go back and visit Chicago, and it's dramatically changed from what it used to be. I mean, there was this flight to the suburbs. I was part of that. My parents lived in one of the suburbs, and the promised land was 5 miles further, out in the further suburbs, so we could have a 55-foot wide lot rather than a 30-foot wide lot. And so we were part of that, quote, problem, unquote. Now, it's reversing itself. The cycle is going the other way. The mayor, to his credit, and a lot of the people in Chicago have realized that there was a lot of wasted space, a lot of the kinds of things that are also going on in St. Louis. Factories that were no longer existent, or warehouses, they were converted into condominiums, and they can't sell them fast enough. I mean, some of them are in the affordable range, some of them are much more gentrified, of course, but it's the opposite. Now the suburbs are having all of the difficulties, and the city is becoming much more healthy. And what's interesting about the discussion that we had with the affordable housing group that met the other day, was talking about the same kinds of things happening in Columbia. And what was emphasized, and I think what's really important, and it was also emphasized by the mayor of Chicago, who we had the privilege to talk to for a while. And he said this problem has to be, it has to start from the folks. It has to start from the bottom up. Government's role can be to set some priorities, local government, to set some priorities and maybe provide some opportunities. But it has to be started from the folks who live there. And one of the topics that we talked a great deal about at that affordable conference the other day had to do with providing information for people, or lighting a fire under somebody, somehow getting them to participate in this whole process. How do you think we can go about doing that?
I have a problem with that statement. You're right, and it's the cookie cutter answer. Mobilize, start the revolution. Yeah, okay. We're not in the 60s anymore, and this is the point that this generation needs to understand. At least I'll have to talk from my heritage. It's just the best way I can relate. My ancestors had to march and fight for social, so that they couldn't get hung from trees for sport, so they could sit in a restaurant and eat without getting their head kicked in. That's different. That's the kind of stuff you march on because you have to put that face forward. The economic and social activism didn't grow at the same pace. I feel safe I can go anywhere in Columbia and eat. Great. But the economics is different. And yeah, I'm telling you, there's been bunches of people mobilizing, but they get squashed in the technical, economic side of getting the problem solved. I talked about this at the affordable housing thing. How many non-for-profits has tried to do something with where intersections at? I know in my lifetime, I know there's probably been about 5 or 6 that tried to do exactly what intersection done. But intersection had the angle as far as working with the government and dealing with the city, and they were able to be successful.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, we're going to talk about some of that in the next segment. We're going to pretty soon. We're going to take a break and take some questions. We also have the privilege now of having a bit of a studio audience, so they may or may not want to get engaged if they're so inclined. I would encourage that.
I might share with you just a couple of things I think we can do. I think when you do mobilize people, there's a lot of different ways that you can approach affordable housing. One of the things that Columbia Housing Authority is doing is we offer a Money Smart class. It's a free class, and what we really do, it's an FDIC program that we use with trained teachers. It's a 10-week program, 1 hour a week for 10 weeks. We offer it on Mondays, either over the noon hour at 6 o'clock in the evening, and we walk people through the whole process of how you go about buying a home. How do you clean up your credit? Because that's another issue for folks. Even if maybe you finally got that job now and you've got the money flow or you could buy your own home, if you're burdened with other credit out there, predatory loans, cars, credit cards, all sorts of things, and then you've got to figure out how you clean that up. And so some of the things are budgeting. Some of the things are just cultural, where people maybe a family hasn't passed that on. Maybe they weren't homeowners, and so nobody taught you about that. So
Phil,
we have to educate there.
I think we're facing a hard break here. So let's continue this on the other side of the break.
Great.
Well, welcome back to the second half of Counterpoint. We took a bit of a break and kept on talking all the way through the break. But I'm here with Phil Steinhaus. He's the CEO of Columbia Housing Authority. And Anthony Stanton, who is a construction contractor specializing in green construction and infrastructure projects. And Rhonda Carlson, who's a builder, developer, and all of them, I believe, is correct. We're members of the City's Affordable Housing Task Force. When we left, just before the break, Phil was talking a little bit about some of the programs that were being offered, and we also discussed a little bit about straightening out this definition of what, the one that we started with, the definition of what affordable housing really is. Do you want to elaborate on or continue?
Sure. Well, it's also important to note when we're talking about affordable housing, we're really focusing on a spectrum of our community that's at or below 80% of the median family income. We are talking about people on the lower end of the wage scale. Seems to be plenty of housing available for people at or above median family income. It's just those that are at or below. So really, to kind of put a thumbnail to it, you're right around $100,000 homes, et cetera. It's pretty hard to get into home ownership these days now, much less than 120 or 130,000. I know there's a few that are out there. The average new home price, I think in 2005 from the Missouri Board of Realtors was right around 147,000 or so. And so you have to have a household income that's closer to 50 to 60,000 a year in order to afford that type of home. So if you're down closer to that, we kind of looked at a benchmark of you've got to make somewhere around $20,000 to $24,000 a year to be able to get into a starter home somewhere around $75,000 or $80,000. So if you're making less than that, you probably can't be a homeowner or find anything to buy.
That's great. One of the other issues that we were talking about at the break, and I'd like to just bring it up to maybe mix things up a little bit, and that is one of the questions I had written down that came up in our discussions recently at the Affordable Housing meeting. Are all development subsidies bad? I don't want to put you on the spot, but as a contractor, what do you think about that? Are there good and bad subsidies, and how should they be allocated? And is that helpful to this affordable housing problem that we're having in Columbia?
I kind of would say yes and no, and mainly because I deal with, and what I talked about when I got up is I deal with supply side issues. And I think that the encouragement might be things that we can offer.
Could you just explain to the folks out there just exactly what supply side?
Well, we had a subcommittee that was for regulatory housing production and design, which was a subcommittee that Anthony, myself, Kurt Wallace was an architect, Annie Pope from the Home Builders, Carol Van Gorp from the Board of Realtors, Wayne Hubert from Hubert Building, and am I missing anybody? I don't think so. That's who was that. That's who attended and worked with our.
Did you say
Ann? Ann Pope.
Yeah.
Yeah, Annie Pope. And what we dealt with, you can certainly talk about narrower streets, smaller lots, but we wanted to deal with things that could be done without utilizing public funds if necessary, and that we could do quickly, that the public could see happen more readily. And so we came up with short-term goals and long-term goals where Phil's group dealt with more things that did deal with things that might require some subsidies, an ombudsman, some possibilities in a housing trust fund. So I can't say that they're bad and I can't say that they're good necessarily. We dealt with things with wanting to look at some things that exist within our planning department that would make things readily more workable for builders to be encouraged to build affordable housing instead of trying to maximize a lot and the price and the house, building more towards where the market is right now.
And just to give you a chance to get back into the discussion here before we maybe take some questions from the audience, we were talking during the break a little bit about how some of these patterns seem to exist between these communities. It can be New Orleans, or it can be Columbia, or it could be New York, or it could be Chicago, it could be any of these. It seems like these are recurrent themes when it comes to affordable housing.
Rhonda brought up the point again. It's about stimulating, it's the government working with the private sector and stimulating a growth pattern that they support. If the city supports affordable housing, they have to stimulate the economy by helping on the regulatory side, on the planning and zoning side. If they make policy that supports affordable housing, then free market will take care of itself. Rhonda and I will, we'll go toe to toe in the marketplace, because then we have the playing field and the tools to do
So
that.
it gets back to that idea of kind of setting priorities, providing some opportunities and maybe providing incentives. Is that?
You know, we can get into incentives, and I want to get away from the subsidies and all that
Well,
kind of
even
stuff.
incentives is interpreted many times by the public at large. And if you just read Trib Talk, you're going to see that we're greedy developers, and guilty as charged.
Right.
We're greedy developers, and all we're concerned
Fascinating
about.
place, Trib Talk.
Lining our pockets and setting ourselves.
But it's not, when we say incentives, I'm not talking about incentives that are ones that are handed to us by the city, but yet maybe working with planning and zoning, which I think Mr. Teddy did a wonderful job of putting together several things that he thought might work. And I think you could do it for affordable housing, any housing, but there could be some other incentives you would offer if there was affordable housing that we talked about sitting at our tables, our little round table discussions. We had several ideas that we came up with that we said, well, maybe reducing some fees, but don't reduce them until after the project has gotten and proven itself. Don't reduce them up front, reduce them on the backside so that the public can see what they're getting for their money if it is something that involves public monies. Because I'm one of those people, I'm not any happier to pay taxes than the next person.
Kind of like an earned incentive.
That is correct.
Is that?
So I don't mean incentives as in here,
Yeah.
wag the carrot,
Yeah.
wag the carrot after I'm through performing
Right.
and showing
That's
what
an
I'm going to
interesting
do.
idea. Well, go
Well, I
ahead.
wanted to say one more thing about the city, and I'll just say, local governments. We have to be honest, or we have to at least know the true intentions of the local governments. I'll give an example. I love the mayor's initiatives concerning health and walking trails and things of that nature in our communities. Because he supports that and because the city has bought into that, you see incentives for us to have
Right.
trails. That's what we need for affordable housing. If it's real, if you're serious about it, then let your policies and your actions in the committees and in council reflect that. And I'm on LaSalle, 315 LaSalle, First Ward. There's a lot of history there, and you have to be conscious of that. And the decisions that we're making now are going to carry on for 50 years. And we're still affected by policies 50 years ago. So if we're really serious, and this is where I'm not convinced that the city's serious yet. If the city is serious about affordable housing in Central Columbia, we're from Missouri. Show me, and we'll go from there.
That's great. I wanted to try and bring the public into this a little bit, our studio audience. If there are some burning questions, I'd like to open it up to the audience.
Yeah, I do have a question, particularly for Anthony. My name's Pat Fowler. I volunteer in Columbia. I live just outside the city limits, so I'm a Boone County resident. But when we talk about reasonably safe and secure in standard condition housing, if that's our benchmark or that's our floor, what policies, Anthony, should the city have right now to take that 70% rental property that's in the First Ward and bring it up to that standard? Because you probably know better than I what percentage of that is truly at reasonably safe, secure, and in standard condition. So where do we put pressure on the city to make that happen?
Well, it can start with having more oversight on landlords, first of all. I think Phil's organization is very instrumental. They have the Section 8. So I don't know what they have standards before they accept Section 8. Reviewing those and maybe lifting those, or being more rigorous in classifying particular properties for Section 8 would be a big help. And I'll go back to the city again. I'll use Kansas City example. 18th and Vine was dilapidated. Yeah. It has historic value, just like Central Columbia has historic value. The city took that back over and renewed it back to its historic glory. They did that by saying, hey, we're not having these slumlords here. We're not having these drug dealers here. We're going to return it back to the jazz days and the Negro Baseball League Museum.
right.
And they set that bar. We can do the same for Central City. Set the bar. Hey, we're not going to have slumlords here. Get your property up, or we're going to do something about it. And there's already the things in place. There's no extra money. There's already the task force that go and look at properties. There's already those things in place. And the pocketbook always rules. If Phil does not like a particular property and it has a history of being, neglected and his tenants are not satisfied there, I know he says it's really between the tenant and the landlord, but he holds the purse strings and he ultimately gives the yay or nay if this property is acceptable for Section 8.
Phil, to follow up on this a little bit, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about a renter's bill of rights, or are we just talking about more code enforcement, or what's the nature of this beast in terms of helping the situation out?
With regards to just Central City and the quality and safety of housing in there?
Right.
Well, with our Section 8 program, we have what's called housing quality standards. They're similar to the city's minimum property standards code. They're a little tighter in some areas. We do annual inspections, not 3-year inspections. We require mechanical inspections of all our gas appliances every year by a licensed mechanical inspector. This year new, we're also requiring carbon monoxide detectors in all our Section 8 properties. And right now the market is, there's a glut of rental housing out there. So I have even people with new apartments calling and say, how do I get my apartments on Section 8? How can I take Section 8? We have probably for one of the first times in recent memory, a more openness and willingness to take Section 8. There is paperwork involved. There are other issues that are involved in that make it a little more difficult than just in the regular rental market. So, if you can take a 4-bedroom house and you can rent it out to 4 college students and for $1,200 a month, then hey, you're probably going to do that over renting it out to us at a more fair market rent, say around $800 a month. So, but if you can't rent it out and it's sitting vacant, then you might be more willing to take Section 8. So we have to be careful about kind of the balance of the market, how tight we tighten it up. If we tighten our standards up too high, then we have landlords that say, hey, and I know folks now. I have friends now that say, I won't put my properties on Section 8. It's too much paperwork. It's too much of a hassle. So there's a balance there, or else we squeeze poor people out of housing. And there's still another issue out there that we haven't talked about, and that's where the housing is going to be for people that are coming out of prison, people that are homeless, people that have been arrested for doing drugs or convicted of violent crimes. There's a lot of landlords that aren't going to take those, including the public housing, including Columbia Housing Authority. If you're involved in drug-related criminal activity or violent criminal activity, you're out. We evict you. That's one of the hard realities that I learned taking this job is I get to do those every week, and it's not easy or something I like to do, but when we're talking about safe neighborhoods, I want a housing authority to be safe.
But that has to be the case, and then we need to do something with what we're left.
Right.
I mean, it's almost an intractable problem.
It is.
I kind of like the way the discussion was going in terms of what you were suggesting, Anthony. That is, you were talking a little bit about some of the solutions and how the city or the city government can help try and start this in motion. And I guess as a representative of the city council, I'm not going to speak for anybody else, just for myself, and I'm not really here in that capacity, but I sure would like a little bit more input from maybe each of you as to what can the city council do specifically to help CHA, for example, or to help your business, for example, or to help your business, for example. I mean, you've touched on a little bit of it, but I think that certainly would be useful information for me, and perhaps the folks at home would enjoy listening to that as well.
I personally, our task force has extended beyond its original intended lifetime, and I think that from the feedback that was received when they did kind of a update to the city council a few months back, that the city council seemed receptive, and at least the feedback that came back to our committee was it's very receptive. I know personally for myself, in sitting down with our subcommittee, the challenge was that, and it also came up at our major committee, was, well, this is the second or third or fourth affordable housing task force. In fact, our book has the original one that we paid consultants, and we had that to review for this particular committee. But it's just going to be another report that's going to get set on a shelf, was what was the statement that was made at that meeting. And I don't want to say I took offense with it, but I took the challenge. And I said, this is the first time I've been on this committee. And I won't let it sit on a shelf. And the reaction we've been getting back from the city council, though I wasn't even present at the meeting, I prepared some stuff through our committee forum, was they were very receptive. And that's what I feel like our committee wants to see, show our community that we can do something in a short term, and we're giving some suggestions. Mr. Teddy's been very kind as saying he would work with us at maybe another committee that has to sit down with him and make those changes to the planning and zoning, some of the density issues and things that we can deal with. But we dealt with, that's why I called it supply side. If somebody's building within the inner city, then let's deal with the infrastructure we're going to improve for the city that's substandard now. Let's talk about what you will get for your dollar. And so I think that the dialogue has opened up, and I think that our group has found it receptive. I know personally there are at least 2 or 3 of us on our committee that are not going to allow it to get put on a shelf, because I think our time is too valuable to be asked to do that. And
Well,
I feel strongly about that.
That's terrific, because I guess
So you'll get recommendations from us.
I'll take the opportunity. I mean, as a rookie councilman, so to speak, one of the things I had the biggest problem with was that when boards and commissions or anybody else would submit a report to the city council, requested or not, and even if it was requested, it would be accepted and then shelved someplace, or at least no one seemed to know where these things went, and they never seemed to appear on the agenda again. And I wasn't sure why that happened that way. I think things have changed a bit. Certainly, I'd like to say some good things about the city manager and his staff, because these things get tracking numbers. They're followed up on, and we see them again, and at least we're forced to make a decision, which is what we're supposed to do. That's what representative government is supposed to
I
do.
think we got a question.
Yeah, another question. Be great.
I'm Ann Peters, and my question is on owner-occupied housing. And are condos and townhomes the new starter homes for first-time buyers? Is that an option in Columbia, and can developers actually make a profit building them?
I think it has been, but subdivision, Kish is one of our occupant of one of the subdivisions that we built. But that was started 12, 13 years ago. And then the land grabs started when the real estate is high, so your cost of land is very high, so then you need to maximize what you're utilizing. So I think it's what started in the 60s, 70s, and 80s price range is now way over 100,000. And because of that particular situation, it isn't a starter home, and you don't see people developing them as starter homes. So
Yeah, I agree. It's that free market capitalism stuff. It's
And this also reminds me, your question kind of suggests to me one of the council's recent series of decisions about a recent mobile home park, and it was an annexation and a rezoning to zone this property as commercial. I mean, strictly in terms of land use, I think that was the proper thing to do, and because it's at the juxtaposition of 2 arterials. But what that means is the same kind of things that we were talking about before. That cycle starts because the land all of a sudden gets more valuable because it's rezoned at a particular level, which means that the folks who are left behind are kind of bypassed in this whole sequence of the free market. That's indeed a problem. I mean, the City Council tried to address it by leveraging as much as possible for relocation, that kind of thing.
I think it has to do with style too. To answer your question, Ms. Peters, we're still Midwest. We're still not big city, but we're not small town still.
That's right.
So condos, row houses, and things of that nature in St. Louis is great because they almost have to be. Here, we still got a lot of land, and people still like yards, and people still got dogs, and so it's a culture thing we have to deal with. We have to change, you know, or not. But that needs to be in the hands of the people that live here. You know, when is it time for condos and row houses and all that kind of stuff?
We downzoned a piece of commercial property to get Spencer's Crest in because we knew there was no possible way we'd get R3 zoning or R4 zoning, any way possible. So we went backwards. It was a piece of ground that a bank owned. It had been in foreclosure, and it was my father's former law partner's old farm. So we took it and saved the commercial for up on 763 because that's the natural place for commercial, and maximize the density on the remainder of it. But we downzoned that piece of ground because there was no way in Hades that you were going to get R3 zoning anywhere. Because neighborhoods don't, the NIMBYism is one of the things I think you had touched on in your comments, and I know that it is a constant problem.
You're referring, I had another question written down here, and the question was, what happened to the Wyatt Acres project? That was out on Ballinger Road in my neck of the woods. And it was a project that seemed to have a lot of potential, but there was quite a backlash in the Garden City area against affordable, what we thought at that time was affordable housing in the area, and that was pretty much characterized by that acronym NIMBY, which is not in my backyard, which is pretty pervasive and with lots of applications.
I'd like to take a swing at that one.
NIMBY.
I think this all goes back to history, and it all goes back to perception. Most people, not Rhonda, she's an exception to the rule, but most people that build affordable housing build it and it looks affordable housing. What I'm trying to get out of it, and I'm definitely trying to do it in New Orleans, is the same amount of energy it took to design this cheap looking house. You could have designed one that looks far better. Because, and I use my neighborhood as a perfect example. I live in the first ward. Most of the houses in my area are either the Sears catalog type, which are, these are classic homes. They're 1920, 1930 Craftsman style bungalows. We've got American four-square architecture. These are classic Midwest architecture that represents where we're from. They were built to be cheap. People that built those did not have lavish budgets. They built them to be efficient, and they built them to be cheap. Those same houses, you take them to Cherry Hill, the exact same architecture you see in Cherry Hill is workforce housing, but now it's nostalgic, so now it's $500,000, $400,000. It's the same houses that are in my neighborhood. They're just in a different place. So that NIMBY thing is, they look cheap, they build them cheap, they cut corners, and that's been a bad reputation that whenever someone comes in with affordable housing, that's a problem. And I hope with our committee that, I don't even want to use the word anymore. After we give you the recommendations, I don't want to use the word affordable housing on anything I do.
Well, let me turn to you, Phil.
Sure.
How can we help you, so to speak?
I want to throw a little curveball in here and make you reframe what affordable housing is and think about it. Part of the NIMBYism that exists is because we have segregated housing in our community. We go to school and we work with people of all economic backgrounds, but we go back to neighborhoods that are segregated economically. And so really, if you want to address affordable housing in our community and we want to use market forces to develop that, what we really need to do is focus our efforts on ending poverty. And when people get out of poverty and pull themselves out of poverty, then they are able to start thinking about home ownership. One of the best things about my job is I get to hand out the certificates at our Money Smart class. And it is really amazing to just see how proud people are to have graduated. And I had this one gal come up and talk to me afterwards, and she was not your typical home buyer. She kind of had a mohawk thing going on, and it was pretty red and sticking out here, and she had a few piercings down her ear, and she, she was not your, I don't know, your traditional home buyer. But what she got really excited about was she said, I got hope now. I know how to go about doing it. I know how to clean up my credit. I know how to save the money. I know how to go about picking the house, getting the loan. I know what PMI is, and I'm looking at her like, what? But it really got me, I just kind of welled up. I'm kind of like that sometimes. But it got me very excited about the possibility of instilling hope in people of being homeowners and hope that you can work your way out of poverty. And so I think that's part of what we need to address.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I find it, we even take it a step further when people really do go beyond the situation they find themselves in. They're even able to cast votes, to participate in the community and the fabric of our community, which is something to really shoot for in our community. I really appreciate this, bringing you folks together. Phil Steinhaus, Anthony Stanton, and Rhonda Carlson for this discussion. Perhaps we'll have to do it again. I don't think we've exhausted the topic.
That's good.
So until next time, please tune in and tell us what you think. It's all about Counterpoint. Thank you.